Welcome to NCSS Here for You. For over 50 years, Northwestern Counseling and Support Services has been providing access to quality psychosocial services to the residents of Franklin and Grand Isle counties. Over the years, as the needs of the community have changed, so too have the programs and services that we make available to assist children, adolescents, adults, families, and seniors. We take our role in the community seriously, and we strive to provide the highest quality services. According to Erik Erikson, a noted developmental psychologist, every person must pass through a series of 8 interrelated stages over the entire life cycle. NCSS provides a continuum of services to meet the needs of individuals who at any point seek assistance. NCSS's purpose is creating a stronger community, one person at a time. Now, let's get to today's show. I'm Joe Halco, Director of Community Relations for Northwestern Counseling and Support Services, and welcome to another episode of NCSS Here for You. Each month on this program, we discuss a human services topic, and we do that with staff from one of our 3 service divisions. Our 3 service divisions are Behavioral Health Services, Children, Youth, and Family Services, and Developmental Services. And, on occasion, we have guests from organizations that NCSS collaborates with throughout the year. This month's episode is titled, Can Violent Behavior Be Predicted? With the recent violent tragedies committed throughout our country, during today's episode we'll review the leading research assessing whether this type of behavior can be predicted, which would enable society to intervene and prevent such violent acts. We'll also review myths about mental illness and violence, the 3 predictors of violence, psychopaths and antisocial personality disorder, and the role that mental health first aid training can play in gaining a better understanding of mental illness, and more. To discuss this subject in greater detail, I'm pleased to introduce this month's guest, and that's Dr. Ted Mabel, the Executive Director of Northwestern Counseling and Support Services. Ted, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to be here.
Now, to begin with, from media reports, it appears that people with mental illness as a group are more likely to engage in violent behavior. Is that true?
Well, you certainly would conclude that, I think, by watching the media on a daily basis. The fact of the matter is that it's the reverse, is that people with mental illness, with a mental illness, is actually more likely to be a victim of crime than a perpetrator of crime. And the second real factor is that predicting violent behavior is, in fact, a very difficult process, very difficult to do.
Now, are there any means by which a mental health professional can precisely determine that a person may complete a violent act?
No, there's no way to date, despite what maybe some companies would say that are selling different products, to be able to predict whether an individual, such as yourself, is going to commit a violent crime. What can be done is that there are certain characteristics that you may fall into a population that is a very high risk of committing a violent crime. Let me use an analogy in healthcare. A physician can't tell you that you are going to die of a heart attack soon. What they can conclude that you fall into a population, you have high blood pressure, you have high cholesterol levels, you're severely overweight. You have all the indicators of a person who will suffer or could suffer a heart attack. So if you're really trying to intervene and reduce heart attacks, you'd certainly look at those population, a population that has those characteristics. The very same thing is in terms when you're trying to predict violent behavior. You can't predict it on a one-by-one basis, but there are characteristics of a population that falls, which we'll talk to, I'm sure, soon, later down the pike, that you know that this is a very high-risk population to commit a violent crime, and if you want to intercede and reduce violent behavior, that would be the population to target.
But as you said, just like with the physician and not being able to pinpoint and say, because of these conditions, I know you're going to have a heart attack, it's the same thing with this.
That's
which
correct.
Is there are certain indicators. However, you can't specifically say you know that so-and-so will
correct.
behave in that manner.
That's correct.
Now, I know that you've studied some of the recent research relating to violence, and could you share some of the findings with us?
Well, the seminal piece of research that's been done today is by the MacArthur Foundation. And they have done a really good control study. And we're going to put up a graph that really summarizes the results. What they did was they had a large population. They followed a large population that left a state mental health hospital. Mm-hmm. And 10 weeks later, they interviewed and looked at that population in terms of what had they done in terms of committing a violent act. And they broke that population down into two categories. That population that was discharged, that had a substance abuse problem, and those clients that were discharged that didn't have a substance abuse problem. They then compare them to a random sample of a population in the same communities or community-like sample, so that they had a control group and an experimental group. So a pretty decent design. And what you can see by the chart is that, first of all, the population that was discharged and had a substance abuse problem had an overall rate about 22% of them committed repeated a violent act. And compared to the regular population that had a substance abuse problem of 11%. So you can see the role of substance abuse plays a significant, is a significant variable when it's combined with a mental illness in terms of being prone to commit violent behavior. If no substance abuse involved, this is the interesting thing. You can see that for the mentally ill population, you had roughly a 4.7% offender charge within a 10-week period, compared to the control population of 3.3%. Almost a negligible difference, almost identical in some ways, just a slight difference increase for the mentally ill plus population. Mm-hmm. So I think that helps explain recidivity to some extent, and the power and the important role of substance abuse when you combine that with mental illness.
So you're right, Ted. When you look at this, so it's negligible without any substance use, but it's virtually double if there's substance abuse involved as well, which is, in that particular vein, that's huge.
That's right. So when you combine a diagnosis of serious mental illness with substance abuse, then you're really putting those two things together really increase the chances of violent behavior.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, are there other predictors of violence?
Right. I think in terms of making an assessment, what you want to look at is probably three things. One is there a history of violence? Okay. Because if there's a history of violence, then in terms, like common sense would tell you, they're probably the individual's more likely to commit a violent act in the future. The second thing that we've just got through concluding is the role of substance abuse. Mm-hmm. There's a history of violence, and this person is a substance abuser. It increases the probabilities of a violent act. Third, when you add a factor such as failure to follow treatment, that they're either not in treatment or refuse to follow treatment, when you combine substance abuse, a history of violence, and unwillingness to follow treatment, increases, fairly high probability of them committing a violent act in the future. Mm-hmm. But it's not perfect, as we've been saying.
Sure. But those are three areas, though, and predictors that when combined and overlaid, you can say, therein lies, with a little more precision, the fact that something can occur.
Exactly.
Now, once again, when reviewing media reports, it seems like psychopaths complete most of the murders. Is that true or false?
Well, I think you get that from the media. Mm-hmm. Murders on TV shows and stuff like that seem to come across with psychopathic personalities, and it's not unlike the situation in which that many crimes, particularly against women, are committed by psychopaths. But let's talk a little bit about the population, and also in terms of what role, in terms of numbers, psychopaths plays. We'll put up another slide in which, if you look at the outer ring of the slide, that represents 100% of all the offenders, let's say. Mm-hmm. And then, if you want to look at those that commit violent crimes, about 65% to 75% of those of those offenders have antisocial personality that commit crime. And then, if you look at psychopaths, they represent about 25% to 30%, 25% of the population that commit violent crime. So there's a role of about 25% of the population, but obviously antisocial personality diagnosis far outweighs psychopath. Now, let's talk a little bit about the whole notion of psychopath, which is, you think of them as kind of dangerous people, and they can be. But many psychopaths function very well in society. In fact, are very charismatic, rise to leadership roles, are charming. They simply don't have a great deal of empathy. They in fact actually seem to have been born with not a lot of empathy. So they can be very, in sales, they can be very successful in business and that sort of thing, and not necessarily dangerous, so to speak. But that obviously there is that aspect of that population that can be very dangerous. They can commit murder, violent act, and they have no feeling of regret or ill feeling towards themselves or feeling bad about the behavior of the dead. And that's what makes them so dangerous. And you combine that with very charming personalities.
Sure.
So they are able to gain entry and trust of people.
But with all that being said, though, the interesting point, though, that you mentioned is the fact that unlike what people might just think on the surface, is it's really a small percentage of the overall offenders that really fall into that category.
That's right.
It isn't perhaps as large
of all
as,
criminals, yes.
as far as people would think. Yeah. Now, in recent years, there seems to be an increase in violent crimes committed by adolescents. Is that true?
Well, I don't know the data on that. I'm going to give my best guess is that if you looked over a 40 or 50 year period, there hasn't been an increase in the amount of crime adolescents, that adolescent population, so to speak. I only say that if you go out west and go to some of the graveyards, like go to Tombstone, and there's still the Boot Hill there, is that sort of thing. You actually read the age of a lot of these gunslingers or people that committed what would be called mass murders here, not necessarily then, were 12, 13, 14 years old, So my guess, like similar to felonies, if you should ask the person on the street, do they think that crimes increase over the last 40 years, particularly if felonies increase over the last 40 years? I would think 9 out of 10 people say, oh my God, yes, things are much worse than they used to be. The fact is, the data doesn't show that. Over a 40 or 50 year period, actually the number of felonies has decreased in this country, surprisingly. So the media now, the social media that is so responsive, so a shooting that happens in Aurora, Colorado is within seconds is known throughout the United States, I think plays a big role in that. What I will say from my own personal experience, having worked in education for over 20 years in part of my career, and being a school principal for 7 to 9 years, there's certainly been a change in schools. It was unheard of. I never thought I would ever see the day that police officers would be in schools, that metal detectors would be in schools. And now almost, particularly in urban areas, I'm sure there's probably not a school left in this country, an urban area, that doesn't have a metal detector, an armed police officer in the school. And as well as here in our own community, I think it's becoming not metal detectors necessarily, but certainly armed police officers are in the school. And I never dreamed you would see the day. And so the violent mass shootings that you've seen by adolescents in schools has something that's really changed, in my opinion. And particularly because I think the most important to parents, that a bastion institution is education. You need, when you send your kid off to school, historically you felt that's a very safe place haven, to be.
Sure.
And I think to some extent we have lost that. And I think parents are fearful. And students are fearful today. I have friends who are teachers in Boston, for example, who say that they admit that to some extent they fear for the self-harm. I think rarely would you see, back in my day, would you feel, you'd ever hear a teacher that would say that they feel unsafe in school. Yes. In terms of particularly being preyed on by the fellow students. It'd be totally unheard of.
Well, I know we were talking, I think it was a week ago, about a statistic that came out that I know we both viewed as extremely alarming, which was since the incident at Newtown, and that's a year and a half ago, is that there have actually been 74 school shootings since then, which tells one that, and I think if we ask the average person, they might think maybe there's one a month or one a quarter or what have you. But to hear a statistic like that
That's right.
plays exactly into what you're saying about how people in what used to be a very safe environment don't feel that way
Exactly.
anymore.
And I think that's why we're gearing up, schools are gearing up to try to regain the confidence and trust of the parents in the community.
Yeah. Now,
Tragic, really.
Now, speaking of educators and schools, what about the ability of other professionals, such as educators, in being able to predict violent behavior in someone?
I think here lies a core answer to the situation, particularly in schools. What we know about, what we're learning from Newtown and Aurora, and that's when the adolescents come into this act, there's some commonalities that have come out of those shootings. And those commonalities are easily observable by school teachers and school guidance counselors and school principals. And some of these commonalities are often these people have been bullied in their life and have bullied and been bulliers. Mm-hmm. And the research has shown if you've been bullied and been a bullier, that is 2 times increases the risk of abnormal behavior or mental health behavior by that particular child. If the child's rejected by peers, the so-called nerd, you can easily observe this in a cafeteria where the child day after day is eating alone with no friends, is in isolation, okay, is being teased. Often a diagnosis, often these children are on an Asperger's continuum, all right, and are really resented. They resent parental improvement, don't want their parents in their life, and the parents find it very difficult in many of these cases to admit that there's a mental health problem here, you know, and really trying to really, maybe it's an educational problem or a learning disabled problem. Another interesting and last comment, in all of those cases, the 3 major ones, is that the adolescent had built up over time a large number of guns and bullets and ammunition. In other words, it would fill a closet. All right, this was a common goal, which tells you that parents often, I think people in adolescence rarely want their parents to enter their bedroom. It does call for probably more supervision in terms of what's going on in an adolescent's life like that, and also particularly closer supervision in the home. You know, in other words, if these parents had seen all this ammunition and guns build up, they could have intervened and could have prevented maybe many disasters on that. So I think there's much to be gained by training community members and teachers and people who are interfaced with children at a younger level.
Now, are there any solutions that you see to this big problem?
Well, I think there's 4 lines of defense that we've sort of hinted around. The first line is really the home structure and supervision. I think, if you find it very hard to relate, identify with your child, and you're finding that the behaviors are starting to get scary, the dress is starting to get scary, then it's time to try to get some help and an assistant for your child. B, when you combine that with closer supervision, taking an interest, what is the child doing in the room and in the house when nobody's around? The second line of defense is the school. Schools need to be safe places, which I think schools are working hard at, but also very easy to observe. Everyone knows who these children are when they're isolated, being teased and stuff like that. There are ways of intervening with these children, okay, and helping them form other peer groups and be adapted to other peer groups so they can everybody needs a friend in school. The third line is really the community. We have programs now for community members to be trained in being able to assess and refer to appropriate places. I think the final analysis is the community at large can have the biggest impact. And lastly is professional care, getting people to a good child psychiatrist, a good therapist quickly when you need it, and not be in denial. So that's a context of 4 different lines of defense, I think, that we can intercede, that can have a tremendous impact on this what you call this adolescent phase of mass murders.
Life. Sure.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of training, since the fall of 2010, NCSS has been offering mental health first aid training to the community. Can you explain how participating in this training is beneficial to those who attend?
Yeah, I am really excited because I see we have been offering, I think, we have sponsored now in this state and in New England, I think one of the largest programs. I think we've trained over 400 people in our community. I really believe, and I'm sort of like a Don Quixote in this, I think that people are sort of have had a hard time converting people. But this is an answer. And the answer doesn't cost a lot of money, and this is something the community can do. And what the community the community just needs to get involved and spend 10 hours, 8 to 10 hours of their time, learning some core pieces of material that they could do in terms of the event if they spot situations like that. So I think mental health first aid is an answer to a major social problem. I'm trying to win people over on that. And the program basically offers an 8 to 10 hour program training in anxiety, depression, psychosis, substance abuse. And in addition, we offer a program on childhood disorders, which is not part of the national, and people get certified in this program. And already in the few years that we've been in business, we've gotten reports back from ministers, school teachers, police officers, nurses, doctors who have been trained about how helpful this has been. And I just can't hammer this enough. When we sort of get so upset about that wanting somebody to react, and Congress has been totally inept in doing anything about this, they're not going to be able to. It doesn't look like there's any hope for any of our solutions in doing anything. I think we as a community could have a major impact on these issues, just with a little training and getting involved at the local community level.
And this training, I think it's important also that people understand, is it doesn't make someone all of a sudden a therapist or being able to diagnose. The important thing is it really teaches people to be sensitive to early warning signs, though. So they're a lot closer to the individual, that much earlier they might be able to help that person seek assistance in some way.
That's correct.
So just like first aid, where somebody comes upon somebody who may have been injured or whatever, well, they're not going to be the doctor,
That's right.
but they can certainly assist and help that person until the appropriate means arrive.
That's right. And the curriculum is designed to be very experiential. In other words, so you basically learn through videos and role playing and stuff like that. Somebody, for example, that's having an anxiety attack, say on an airplane with sitting next to you, what could you do? So you teach them, you actually role playing breathing exercises and stuff like that, of which you could be of help. And make suggestions of kinds of people you could refer them to. So we've had nothing but positive comments about the training, and I'm just doing my little best. The interesting thing too, there are training programs throughout the state of Vermont. Each community mental health clinic has 2 people who have been trained, and so each community mental health clinic throughout the state should be able to offer this curriculum. We here at NCSS have, I think, trained close to 27 people and are going to be trainers. And we've trained over 400 people, and we plan to hammer away at it every year. We not only will we offer to the general public, but we're targeting populations where we're going into primary care offices, we're going into nursing homes, doctors' offices, hospitals, that sort of thing. We're actually tailoring training to different schools. There is a national movement right now, and there's money that's been appropriated by Congress for school districts to develop mental health first aid for children. And when we say children, and teachers, teachers in schools, and even including maybe seniors in high school, that sort of thing. So this is our major thrust in the coming few years, is to get into the school systems. And schools will be able to get money to pay for this training.
Now, speaking of the community, when is the next time that NCSS will offer this training to the local community?
We'll be offering starting October 7th, we'll be offering this training over a 4 or 5 week period. I believe it's Tuesday nights. Tuesday nights, and we will be. That's the kind of training we'll be offering year in and year out to the general public at large. At the same time, we will be working with the various schools around the state to be able to offer that training in schools. But as you say, the curriculum covers early warning signs, intervention, and referral options for the people at large. So we encourage people to call us, approach us, and sign up and get in class. We limit class size to 20, and that's because of the experiential nature of the material. So first come, first serve. And we've had a full class, and I think that we've been doing this for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And we've not had a class that hasn't been filled. So we're excited about that.
Yes, and I can mention that anyone who might be interested in attending the fall session, they can call Rachel Cobb at 393-6406 to register. That's Rachel Cobb at 393-6406. So, Ted, you mentioned some of the specific groups that we've also, or that the organization has also targeted to assist with providing them with this training. And it's really been across the board, hasn't it, as far as like law enforcement, the Abenaki community?
That's right.
As you had mentioned, primary care providers, nurses, a lot of individuals who, in one sense or another, might be deemed as first responders when it comes to someone who might be struggling.
That's right. And I think we still have a ways to go. But we've been working with the Notch, and we've gone into the physician practice. We've trained the physicians of the Notch as well as all their staff, so we think that major headway. Because one of the things that we know that interesting piece of data that I just can't get over is that if somebody's considering suicide, for example, it's a huge percentage, something like 70% of them have seen their primary care physician within the last 60 to 90 days. Okay? So it tells you something in terms of where to intervene, places to intervene, schools, doctors' offices, okay, are major areas of where we could intervene much earlier and see it get things done.
Another very positive aspect of this is the fact that as we get closer to integrated health care, is that if somebody is in the primary care provider, certainly having a mental health professional in the practice is a good thing. But just the ability for them to be able to maybe themselves detect some of these earlier warning signs is going to be very beneficial.
That's correct, yeah. And hopefully mental health first aid will play a major role in, as we get more and more integrated in our healthcare delivery system, we will be able to train the personnel in those systems in a common model to be able to screen and do some of this early intervention, early prevention. There's historically never any money for this. So we're not being funded to this. We just believe in it. We believe in the final analysis. This is the only thing that will work. And so it's really a sales job to convince the community at large there's something they can do. Don't wait for Congress.
Sure.
Get out and get trained. And because look at, when somebody is coming down with an illness, the people that know first are family, relatives, neighbors, okay? And often don't fearful to intervene or know how to intervene or what they could do. This supports them, okay, in a series of interventions that could be meaningful and pay off, and they feel the support of being trained and having the knowledge of how to intervene and talk to people who are beginning to have the early stages of mental illness.
And on that note, that's a great note to end on. Believe it or not, our time is up. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Ted Mabel, for being on the show today and sharing his insights on violent behavior and if it can be predicted. I also want to thank you, the viewer, for spending time with us again this month. You can learn more about NCSS and all of our programs and services by logging on to ncssinc.org. I'm Joe Halco, and I'll be back next month with another episode of NCSS Here for You. This has been another episode of NCSS Here for You. We hope that you found today's discussion informative and educational. For over 50 years, Northwestern Counseling and Support Services has been providing access to quality psychosocial services to the residents of Franklin and Grand Isle counties. Over the years, as the needs of the community have changed, so too have the programs and services that we make available to assist children, adolescents, adults, families, and seniors. Thanks once again for tuning in this month. NCSS's purpose remains creating a stronger community, one person at a time.